I think you sound.
Okay. All right. So, to all of you online, thank you so much for your patience as we work through a couple of technical difficulties. It wouldn't be a program or an event if we didn't have a few, right? So I want to say hello. My name is Candace Perry, and I am the director of the Office of Environmental Justice at New Jersey's DEP, our Department of Environmental Protection. So I want to give a warm welcome and welcome you to our Navigating the DEP System seminar series. So this is the second installment of that seminar series. And so warm welcome to all of you that I'm speaking to online for tuning in to join us, and all of you in person, especially if it is your first time coming to be with us here at the DEP in our headquarters. So I want to give you a bit of background for why we're all gathered here to be doing this Navigating the DEP seminar series. And so it was really important for us to plan this series because when we think about one of the guiding principles for environmental justice, it is that the most impacted and the most affected communities speak for themselves, right? And so in order to speak for yourself, you need to know a few things. So one, what is the decision about your health or about your environment that's being decided on? So is it that there's going to be a new facility that's moving into your neighborhood, for example? Like, what is that decision? Second is, who is responsible for making that decision? So is it the DEP that's responsible? Maybe it's your city council or your city planning board that's responsible, or some other entity. Next is, what opportunities exist for you to influence those decisions about your public health and about the environment? So is there a public meeting that's coming up? Is there an opportunity to comment or to provide public testimony? And then lastly, in some cases, it can work for you to bulldoze down the door and to make sure that you're included in those opportunities to have influence over those decisions. But ideally, you'd have an invitation into that decision-making point. So when we think about environmental justice, and one of those founding principles is that the communities speak for themselves and that we achieve justice when there is a meaningful opportunity for people to have decisions about their quality of life. In order for it to be meaningful, it means that you're going to be equipped to show up with the information and access to information to make the best decisions for you. And so how can you be equipped or prepared to make decisions if you're not informed? And so many times as government officials, we can kind of take for granted that we may be speaking past communities, that we may not be taking the time to sit down and explain information in ways that communities can understand. Because if you have that information and you are equipped with the information, you can better be prepared to come to the table and to make those decisions that are going to affect your quality of life and your neighborhoods and your communities and your families. So this is our attempt to do just that with this Navigating the DEP System seminar series, is to equip you with the information that you need to be able to make decisions about your community and your family's health and the best ways for you. And so today's seminar series is about part one of understanding the regulatory process. So as a regulatory agency, DEP has many things that we do every day along the terms of regulations. And so today we're going to help you break down and explain, specifically talking about the environmental justice law. And part two of this seminar series will go into more detail about other types of regulations for other type of media that the department has jurisdiction over. But today we're going to focus on the environmental justice law and the regulations and all of the processes that are accompanied with that. So before we dive deep into the agenda, I just want to invite a colleague up to the podium to share some few words with you, Halima Shabazz from the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, who's going to give us an introductory warm welcome from the perspective of an environmental justice advocate. So Halima, please come.
Thank you, Candace. Can everybody hear me well? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Halima Shabazz. I am the Special Projects Manager at the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance. I want to thank the DEP and the Office of Environmental Justice for hosting these essential seminars and community engagement events. These have created an environment for people in overburdened and environmental justice communities to have an opportunity to listen, learn, and be heard. I have the honor to speak from the perspective of an emerging environmental advocate, and I'm learning that the more we stand up, the more power we have in what goes on in our neighborhoods. Excuse me, the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance was founded over 20 years ago in the state as the first grassroots environmental justice organization. Our early members came from all over the state, and we actually were based right here in Trenton at the Thomas Edison College for most of our years. Our office now sits in Newark, and we are still dedicated to drawing our resources, technical assistance, and training in New Jersey's most environmentally impacted communities, including Trenton. Each community has its own pressing issues. In some places, there may be incinerators. In others, there may be poisonous gases coming up from the ground. In some places, there may be air quality issues from trucks and cars. And in some places, there may be lead and soil in the water. And while these may be our main issues, the one thing that we have in common is that we must stand up in our communities, and the change starts with us. So we're here today in the hopes of creating relationships with Trenton changemakers as we work to transform the realities on the ground. Unfortunately, our executive director, Melissa Miles, was unable to be here, but she sends her greetings today. On that note, we would like to invite you to our upcoming event in Atlantic City, which is also held in partnership with the DEP. This event is going to be held on Saturday, March 23rd at Stockton University, and will focus on community-based organizations and individuals with the information and technical assistance they need to successfully apply for state and federal funding. The DEP has sent out the save the date email, and you can find the QR code outside on the table and a flyer with more information. Before I finish, I would just like to call your attention to a few more informational flyers on the table. One of the informational flyers explain the environmental justice law that you will hear about later. The second info sheet is in Spanish and English on our cumulative impacts. Cumulative impacts describes the many sources of pollution in our neighborhoods and how they affect the health and well-being of the people who live there. And the final information sheet is about the impacts of diesel pollution from heavy-duty trucks on our air quality and health. So we hope that these will be helpful in the environmental justice work. Our contact information is also on the table as well. And if you would like to sign up to learn more about what we do, we invite you to do so. And we're looking forward to supporting the communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Halima. So we will transition right into our agenda, and I want to invite up our esteemed leader of the Department of Environmental Protection, Commissioner Sean LaTourette, who's going to give us an overview of the DEP and how we function. And then he'll do a dive into the history of environmental laws and how we're getting to this moment of having an environmental justice law in New Jersey, and an overview of the regulatory process. So, Commissioner.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Candace. Thank you to our friends at New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance for being with us. To those who are joining us online, thank you for your participation in this important seminar series, and to the partners who've organized this with us, and to those here in the room who were able to make it to Trenton to join us this afternoon. And for those who are online and may only see, I'm not sure what you're seeing, so you may only be seeing me, which is just fine. But what you wouldn't see or may not be seeing is the inside of this room. And it is very sparsely populated. And I think in part because it's a rainy day, in part because we started this at 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the city of Trenton in central New Jersey. It's central, y'all, just to be clear, it's a thing. Now, typically, this is the way we've done things over the years, holding public convenings in this obscure, somewhat imposing concrete building in the middle of Trenton. And it hasn't always been accessible to all of the people and communities that we serve. If your mom was anything like mine, balancing 3 jobs and certainly interested in the environmental conditions in her community and the impacts of environmental issues upon her children, she certainly couldn't get to Trenton on a, what's today? Wednesday. On a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. I offer that point not as a reflection on the great organization that it takes to put on an event like this. It's part of the reason we do these things, both hybrid and in person and in multiple locations and on all sorts of different days. Right? Because, as Candace mentioned, a foundational principle of how we further the promise of environmental justice is to ensure the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people in all communities, in all places, on all environmental issues. But in order to do that, we have to make ourselves more accessible. We have to hold events and opportunities to engage with the public we serve in multiple formats, in multiple languages, in multiple locations, in order to maximize our ability to reach people where they are and to make it easier for communities to engage with us. That is part of the work of doing, or part of the work of furthering the promise of environmental justice. I always try to correct myself when I may be inclined to say doing environmental justice, because it's never done. And every day we all work at furthering that promise, rather. So I think my job today is, as Candace explained, to wrap up 50 years of modern environmental law and the changes that are coming here in New Jersey and hopefully around the country in 30 minutes. We couldn't possibly do that, right? But I'm going to give you an overview. And to my DEP colleagues in the room, I am certain that there's going to be something that I say that is wrong, that gives short shrift to the importance of the programs that you all run and that have improved the quality of our environment broadly across this state and work for which we thank you. So I'll ask you to not hold it against me as I'm going to give the Cliff Notes version so as to pave the way for Candace and Dave and others to offer some reflection on this new approach under New Jersey's environmental justice law, which is our real goal here today, to show you how it works, to talk about how you engage with the Department of Environmental Protection under this new paradigm. But to truly engage with a new paradigm, you have to understand the existing one. And so I'll just start with a bit of orientation. First, about what the DEP is, and then what permits are, and then why they matter, and how we do better collectively, all of us, all the time. So the first thing to understand about the DEP is just how large we are in terms of the areas that we cover and how much our agency has impact upon communities all across the state of New Jersey. But also to explain a little bit about how constrained the operations of environmental law can be. So just to give you a bit of context, DEP is at least three things. The first is our environmental quality assurance agency. And what I mean by that is it is incumbent upon the Department of Environmental Protection to implement state and federal laws that are meant to improve upon environmental and public health conditions. And we do that by improving and protecting the quality of our air, the quality of our water, the management of our waste streams, to both identify impairments in our environment and to set the parameters for improving upon those conditions and to protecting environmental resources over time. And we do that within our air, our land, our water. And if you were to look at the organizational structure of DEP, and I'm not going to bore you with an organizational chart, but one's available right on our website, you would see the structure of the institution in very much that vein, right? But environmental quality is not the only work we do. We also do the work of natural resource management. On the federal level, that's work that's done by the Department of the Interior, for example. And so we're responsible for, on the state level, managing nearly 1 million acres of public land, ensuring the good care of our fish and wildlife and the habitats of each. We're responsible for managing our parks and forests and historic sites, the state parks and forests and historic sites, not the local ones, but we do invest in those. Which brings me to the third category, which is DEP as the largest investor in our state and in our region in environmental infrastructure, whether that is investment in our water infrastructure, investment in our local parks infrastructure and ability to serve the public, or many other types of programs that are meant to improve public health in our environment and to protect public safety. So for example, through our flood resilience infrastructure planning and development programs. So those are three broad areas that DEP covers, but really today, what we're going to talk about is just that first, right? Work that is also shared on the federal level with the Environmental Protection Agency. And I'll explain the distinction between those two agencies at the federal and at the state level. But it would serve us to do that in a bit of context. If we rewind the clock to maybe the 1960s and certainly early 1970s, when the first major national environmental laws were formed. And this is a time, if you can imagine, and I'm sure maybe you could, given the conditions of our air quality just last summer throughout the tri-state area, when skies were stricken orange from the occurrence of ground level ozone and impairments from Canadian wildfires. But there was a time where those types of air quality impacts were more commonplace, where they were happening often, right? Localized air pollution marking our skies and rivers that were literally catching on fire. That was the story in the 1960s and 1970s and led to the passage of the Federal Clean Water Act, the Federal Clean Air Act. And the way that these federal laws work is very critical to the perpetuation of environmental injustices and our work to further the promise of environmental justice. And I'll give you just a few points on how they function, because it's important to understand when you're engaging with the Department of Environmental Protection and trying to have your voice heard and meaningfully engage so that our outcomes do broadly serve all. So the first thing to understand about both, broadly speaking, air quality and water quality stems from those original pieces of law in the 1970s. Ultimately, it came to be that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency sets standards and establishes programs for the identification of environmental ills and for the improvement of environmental conditions by regulating sources of pollution. The federal government sets up these programs and then hands the reins over to the state government for the state government to perform those programs. Not in every state, but certainly in the state of New Jersey. We have what I'd refer to as maximum assumption of the implementation of environmental laws. And that's not the case in every state. And then in addition, in New Jersey, we have freestanding state laws that further add to the protections. I think of this often as the federal floor. The federal government sets a floor on how the environmental regulatory scheme, standards, and application and regulation of sources of pollutions, how it can be at the baseline. And then the state has the freedom, if it chooses, through acts of its legislature and the administration of those laws, to go further, to protect their residents better than the federal law would alone. In the state of New Jersey, we have a long, proud, and bipartisan history of far exceeding the federal floor in most instances. And that means that our residents largely only deal with the Department of Environmental Protection when it comes to engaging on permitting decisions and environmental harms and compliance and enforcement matters in their communities. It's rare that residents need to engage with the Environmental Protection Agency within the state of New Jersey, though there's a regional office that serves this state. And that's because we've always gone above and beyond where the federal government is. They watch over us, though. They make sure that we are at least meeting that federal floor. So in your communities, for those gathered here, for those that are with us online, it's important to understand how in these discrete, what we call media areas, you would engage with the DEP. And we're going to center our conversation here today on permitting, but that's not the only way to engage with the DEP. There's many, many functions of our agency with respect to monitoring the environmental conditions throughout our state, the conditions in our air, the conditions in our water, the conditions on land. There's a lot of ways to engage with the DEP about the work we do to plan the improvement of environmental features, of natural resource restoration, and so many other functions. And there's ways to engage with us about funding opportunities to improve upon your local environment. But in this very discrete area of permitting, I would break it down into our primary media areas, where we're talking about largely the permitting of facilities that have externalities for our air, for our water, or for our land-based resources. And you'd find these media areas represented in DEP's organizational chart as the Air, Energy, and Materials Sustainability Program. The Division of Air Quality, for example, is the entity within DEP, the division within DEP, that reviews permit requests for the construction and operation of facilities that may have adverse air pollution impacts that need to be controlled. So too is it true in the water space, where our water resource management program, whether it's our division of water supply or our division of water quality, is examining in the context of wastewater. I'll give you an example, a facility that may discharge wastewater, whether it's an industrial facility or a publicly owned treatment work that is meant to clean and purify wastewater before it enters a stream. These facilities receive 2 permits to construct and to operate that can become points of public engagement, right? When a new facility is proposed to be located in your community, you have an opportunity to engage with the Department of Environmental Protection, with the applicant for such a permit, so that you can understand what is proposed, so that you could influence the outcome of decision-making. So too is it true in our watershed and land management program through the Division of Land Resource Protection, that folks that are proposing to build certain types of development that might impact a regulated land resource like a wetland or a flood hazard area has to receive a construction permit, not an operations permit for a land-based for that watershed and land management program. But the others where we see the most engagement on behalf from advocacy organizations where we see the most engagement from community members is often within the confines of these permitting programs, largely the permits that pertain to air pollution, that pertain to wastewater pollution, that pertain to the management or construction of waste managing facilities like recycling centers or scrap yards or other types of facilities of that nature. So I'm going to remark upon those particular areas and how those permits work, since our focus is on permitting today. So I'll give you the example of a new manufacturing facility that's proposed to make, I don't know, let's say widgets, because they always taught me that in school, everybody makes widgets. So let's say that there was a new manufacturing facility that was going to be located just across the street from our DEP building, and they were going to manufacture widgets. And in the course of manufacturing those widgets, they have to heat the widgets up real hot in order to bend and fabricate the metal that they are using to make the widgets. And then maybe they drop that widget when it's all done into a vat of certain types of chemicals to cure it. All of those activities in making those widgets are going to have some potential pollution outcome, and likely the case that they will require some form of permitting from the Department of Environmental Protection. If we're heating up those widgets to a hot temperature or we are grinding them down, we may have air pollutants that are generated during that process. And the applicant has to come to the Department of Environmental Protection to receive a permit to construct and to operate that facility so that air emissions are better controlled. So too is the case for wastewater emissions that may come, or wastewater discharges rather, that may come from that facility making widgets, where they drop that widget in a vat of chemicals to plate it or to finish it or whatever the process may be to reach the end product. That vat of chemicals, or even it's just washed down water, it has to go somewhere. And oftentimes that somewhere is either discharged to a publicly owned treatment facility or potentially to a waterway. And so that process too would require a permit in order to discharge pollution. Some folks that are cynical might say that the DEP is the Department of Environmental Pollution Permits. And that's not wrong. Our goal fundamentally is to evaluate the impact or potential impact of pollution generating facilities and to constrain that pollution as much as possible to meet standards often set by the federal government and improved by the state that are protective of public health and the environment. It is not the case that every time you see a smokestack that is got a white cloud of water vapor rising in the landscape, that smokestack is emitting pollution harming your health. Nor is it true that every pipe that is discharging an aqueous or a liquid into a waterway is that polluted and going to harm your health or your community. If we're doing our jobs right, if we're hearing from you, what we are doing is evaluating the potential for pollution, and we are requiring an applicant for that type of permit to apply pollution controls that would be protective. But here's the hitch in that system. What we have historically focused on, us meaning the DEPs and the EPAs of our country, we have focused on throughout the last 50 years of modern environmental law, point sources of pollution. So for example, that widget factory, the law empowers us to look at that facility and ensure it has pollution controls if it's going to have outputs through its smokestack at a certain level and of a certain kind. And then we can constrain that point source. It's not the case that we can say yes or no to the entire facility. The fact that it can be a manufacturing facility in the heart of one of the most vulnerable communities in our state is not the inquiry that we are empowered to make. The inquiry that we're empowered to make is about that smokestack, not about the whole facility even, about whether or not that smokestack is putting out too much pollution as calculated based on usually wide geographic areas called national ambient air quality areas. Now, what has happened over time and what has sown environmental injustice has been the siting of a multiplicity of pollution generating facilities, all concentrated in generally the same area. Because what we have looked at, what the laws have empowered us to do, is to make sure that each facility, one at a time, the widget factory, the water treatment plant, the power plant, the recycling facility, and so on and so forth. The law has empowered us to make sure that each time one of those is developed, that it has the state-of-the-art pollution controls. The law has not empowered us until recently to look at the baseline conditions on a really granular community level and ask ourselves the question of how much is too much. Meaning that we've looked at, if you take those manufacturing facilities, those energy generating units, those power plants, we've looked at them stamp by stamp. We've not looked at the full page of stamps. Environmental law has this underlying presumption that if we control pollution from each individual postage stamp, that the whole book is going to be okay. And that's not really what's happened. I'll say that this process of implementing modern environmental law, it has broadly resulted in improvements for everyone, right? It has clarified our waters. It's made our drinking water more safe and secure. It's improved our air quality, but it has in its application also led to the existence of dense pockets of pollution where a multiplicity of these facilities are located, right? So take, for example, the Ironbound in Newark, right? Or what is the industrial corridor in Elizabeth, or even the industrial center in more suburban Edison, New Jersey. You can find examples in almost every county, in almost every region of the state, where we've concentrated industrial activity and assumed that by looking at one postage stamp at a time and applying pollution controls on each of those postage stamps, that everybody's going to be okay. Broadly, we are all better off, but at the same time, there has been an overburdening of communities where the greatest density of facilities have been located, often places that are also transportation corridors, areas around our ports and major arteries of transportation, because that's where business and manufacturing has sought to locate over the years. In many ways, the environmental injustice that has been sowed is not purposeful, although there's some examples of that too. But we've realized something really important, that we can, if empowered through the passage of new law, better evaluate the baseline conditions in a community so that we are being informed by the lived experience, the on-the-ground experience of our communities that have been overburdened over the years, that are home to a multiplicity of facilities, and not look at just one postage stamp at a time, but instead to look at the whole page in that community and say to ourselves, as a new facility is proposed or an existing facility is sought to be expanded, how much is too much. And our environmental justice law, as Candace will explain, and our environmental justice rules, as Dave Pepe will explain and others will speak to this afternoon, our environmental justice law, for the first time in the history of these United States, empowers the DEP to look at what we have not been able to evaluate before, what environmental law has not enabled us to evaluate before. And through doing so, we can over time have more just outcomes. It's not going to automatically correct the environmental ills that are already existing in our communities, but it can help us to avoid the further overburdening of communities that have borne the brunt of the pollution that we all together create. I'll close with one story, and then I'll ask if Candace if I've hit the mark. When we were working to pass the environmental justice law, and the work to do so was years long, started by many members of that original environmental justice alliance that our friend here today greeted us from, put forward a law that would allow us to evaluate the cumulative impacts, right? And just, I forgot to say this, so let me back up a moment. When we're looking at that postage stamp by postage stamp, we're looking at the individual impact of each facility. What the environmental justice law allows us to do is to look at the cumulative burden across a set of facilities in each community when a new facility or expanded facility of certain types are proposed. We call that a cumulative impacts analysis in shorthand, although I prefer to use the term disproportionate impact analysis, because what we're really asking ourselves is, what is the cumulative burden? And how do we ensure that that does not disproportionately fall upon our most vulnerable residents, right? How can we make sure that a new facility is not the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak? And as we were working so hard to pass this law that had been advocated for years, I tried explaining this to my children, who were then only 10 and are now 13. I tried explaining to them that all of these environmental laws that we've developed over time, that we've well implemented, that the fine people of the DEP who have made environmental protection the cause of their lives have worked so hard to implement, why it is the case that some communities have more landfills, have more scrap yards, have larger sewer treatment plants, have a greater number of pollution generating facilities. And my children couldn't understand why, because they thought my job was to make sure that never happened in the first place. Unfortunately, that wasn't the job your environmental agencies were tasked with in the very beginning, but it is the job that they're tasked with now. That means we all have to learn to do our work a little bit differently, more inclusively, more collectively, with greater emphasis on the evaluation of community level impacts, and finally getting the power to do more than we had before, right? It means learning new ways, it means leaning in to the authorities we now have that we never had before, meaning that we now have the power to apply conditions and restraints and restrictions that are unburdened by the limitations of that Clean Water Act, that are unburdened by the limitations of that Clean Air Act, that allow us to do things like try and improve on the source of mobile emissions when we are have a permit before us for a stationary source of emissions. This notion can make a storied environmental quality professional's head explode, because they were never allowed to do that before. And I offer that as a perspective on the fact that we are all learning to do this new work, this better work together, and that we need to hear from you, and we hope that you too are patient with us but at the same time that you hold us accountable to the values I'm sharing here with you today, because we firmly believe that everyone, no matter where you come from, no matter what you look like, no matter how much money you make, everyone deserves the benefits of a strong and healthy environment. And I look forward to how Candace and David and others will explain these processes to you. And I look forward to your engaging with us and holding us accountable to our values, ones we know that our communities share. We're all in this work to do better, to do the right thing, and to further the promise of environmental justice. And I thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Okay, so we're going to transition into a deeper dive into the environmental justice law and the regulations that implement the law. So I'll take that up next, and we're just waiting for the slides to get queued up. Okay, perfect. Need some assistance for the clicker. Huh. Try it again. Where am I pointing it? To you, okay. Okay, we're good. Okay, all right, so we're gonna dive into the mechanics of the environmental justice law and the regulations. So first I wanna start with, if you just Google the environmental justice law, you'll find some declarations that were written into the law by our legislators. And these declarations are really important in terms of framing, and just to start with, because it really speaks to and sets the tone and the direction for the DEP and how we are to implement the environmental justice law, speaks to the intent. And so it talks about some of the things that the commissioner just shared with us, that all New Jerseyans, despite who they are, despite their race or their income, that they deserve to live and work and recreate in a healthy environment, that historically these communities have been subject to a disproportionate amount of pollution. And we'll talk about disproportionate and what we mean by that in a minute. And that legacy of pollution continues to pose a threat to those communities. And so it goes on to talk about that it is in the interest of the state to limit the future placement of these facilities. And so the commissioner was talking about this paradigm shift in environmental laws and how environmental laws are implemented within the state. And so let's just talk about this point about that it's within the state's interest to limit the future placement of these facilities and talk about how we do that. But first, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about just the advocacy community who fought for the environmental justice law for years and years and years. And their dedication is what allows me the privilege to be able to speak to you about how the DEP has been implementing the law. So thank you for the commitment and for the passion of these advocates that you see on the screen. Okay, so we want to get into some terminology. Remember, the commissioner was saying that the environmental justice law fundamentally asks the DEP to ask ourselves this question: are some communities experiencing more than their fair share of pollution than others? And so our next step is to define what we mean by more than their fair share. And so the way to do that is to think through disproportionality. And so disproportionality, a synonym for that is disparity, whether or not an impact that is being felt or faced by a community is disparate in nature. And so disparate or disproportionate is a comparative term. And so let's just break it down. If we say that a disparate impact is adversity plus disproportionality. So what is adversity and disproportionality? So adversity, when we say that something is adverse, you can think of it as being bad, as being harmful. So is the impact faced by the community bad or harmful in nature? That's adversity. Disproportionality is that community experiencing a greater share of that adversity as compared to others? So we have an impact, is it good or bad? If we determine it's bad, are they experiencing more of that bad adversity than others? If so, that's what we mean by disproportionality. And so let's talk about a stressor, because we'll talk about this and it'll come up a lot in my talk. So a stressor is an environmental, or it can be a chemical or non-chemical factor that may cause public health impacts. So we can think of that as particulate matter. We can think of it as different forms of pollution like ozone, or we can think of it as non-chemical and kind of socio-economic impacts like your education level or how much income you have. So these factors within society that will or may cause a public health impact. And so the commissioner used this term of a cumulative impact analysis. And so the law is asking us to conduct one of these. It's to add up the adversity plus the disproportionality and to say, what is the total count of both those chemical and those non-chemical stressors within an environment or within a group, and to determine whether or not there's some disparity going on of whether or not that total count of stressors is adverse in some communities rather than others. And so there's two types to do a cumulative impact analysis. You can do it based on a health risk assessment, where you're establishing whether or not there's disparity based on health outcomes, and you're assigning scores to how some communities are worse off because of the health impacts that they experience. Or you can do how we do ours in New Jersey, and that's through a comparative analysis. And so that's where you are taking the total count of stressors in one place, and you're comparing that total count to the total count in another place. And you're saying which one is greater and which one is less to establish disparity. So some terminology, and let's put that into context for you as we move along. So when we think about the environmental justice law, the first step is to determine where it is applicable. So there's 3 steps through our environmental justice law and the regulations that implement it. And so the first step is to determine applicability. And so the environmental justice law is applicable when 3 criteria are met. And so the first is the facility is located in or is proposing to be located in an overburdened community. And I'll talk about that definition in a slide or 2 next. The second criteria is that the facility is defined as one of 8 types of facilities. So if you look up the law, there are 8 types of facilities. So we're talking about power plants, we're talking about incinerators, recycling facilities, and many others. There's 8 of them that are applicable. And then the third criteria is whether or not that facility, as defined by the law, that's proposing to or is already located within an overburdened community is requesting a permit. So the commissioner talked about permits earlier, is requesting a permit from the department. So we're talking about an air pollution permit, a water pollution permit, a land use permit, and so on and so forth. There's a few specific types within the law. So the definition of our overburdened community. An overburdened community defined by the law is a block group where at least 35% of households identify as low income, or at least 40% of households identify as minority or a member of a state recognized tribe, or at least 40% of those households have limited English proficiency. So that means that English is not their first language, or they don't speak English very well. So the emphasis here is on the word or. You just need to meet one of these 3 in order to be determined as an overburdened community. And so within our state, we have 350 of our state's 564 municipalities that have overburdened communities at the block group level within their municipal boundaries. So what do I mean by an environmental justice community as compared to an overburdened community? And so those 2 terms aren't necessarily interchangeable. If we think about this Venn diagram, it'll help us to put it into context. So our overburdened community, we can think of that as the circle in blue. And so those overburdened communities, like we just talked about, are based on demographics. So your income status, your minority status, or your LEP, limited English proficiency. Now, if we layer on top of those overburdened communities, those communities that experience a disproportionate amount of environmental and public health stressors, and those communities that experience a lack of environmental benefits. And so here we're talking about tree canopy or open space or parks or green stormwater infrastructure, because we know that environmental justice or injustices are not just about pollution disparities, but it's also about a disparity and the lack of environmental benefits that these communities have. We know that some communities are hotter in the summer, up to 10 to 20 degrees hotter in the summer than other communities that have open space and tree canopy, for example. So the nexus of those three is what we define as an environmental justice community in New Jersey, and our overburdened communities are defined based on their demographics. So our environmental and public health stressors. The law has some language for the Department of Environmental and Public Health stressors, and our job as a department was to refine these stressors and come up with a list of stressors and data, publicly available and accessible data that we could use to determine that disproportionality. So we want to look at what stressors exist within our environment and where can we source data for those stressors to be able to track that baseline of pollution and how some facilities might contribute to that baseline to then effectuate a disproportionate impact to some communities. And so after a few rounds of stakeholdering, we were able to whittle down our list of environmental and public health stressors to 26. And so I have them listed here as a summary. And so they're everything from concentrated areas of air pollution to mobile sources of air pollution to contaminated sites, and also stressors that may cause public health impacts. And so within our analysis, we don't have public health data in and of itself. We have stressors, environmental stressors that we're saying may cause public health data. So just to explain there, as an example, instead of having elevated blood lead levels within our analysis, what we're using as a proxy or a surrogate for that information is the age of housing, because we know that housing of a certain age had lead paint in it. So that can be a indicator of a public health outcome, which would be having elevated blood lead levels instead of having that public health data in and of itself. So we have some stressors that speak to those that may cause public health outcomes. And we also have stressors that speak to the social determinants of health. So education and unemployment. Okay, so I promise you that there are 3 steps through or within our environmental justice law. So we talked about where the law is applicable. We talked about some definitions and some terminology in terms of environmental and public health stressors. So now we're going to talk about step 2 in the process. Step 2 is that we're going to require a facility who's subject to the environmental justice law to prepare an environmental justice impact statement. And so that impact statement is a public document that they need to prepare that explains what is the existing pollution that is experienced by the overburdened community in question, and how might the facility contribute to the pollution that's already within the community, and what are the steps that the facility can take to minimize and avoid those contributions to pollution. And so the facility will prepare this document, they'll send it to the DEP, we'll post it, and we'll give the public a meaningful opportunity to review and to comment on that EJIS document. So the next part in our process is there's this meaningful public participation process where the facility is required to have a public hearing in the overburdened community in question, and to have an opportunity to discuss and present and explain their environmental justice impact statement, and then the opportunity for the public to say what they think about that EJIS. So it's an opportunity for the DEP to collect and to hear the comments and the testimony about this facility in question, which leads us to the next step in our process, which is establishing whether or not a disproportionate impact would be felt and to avoid that disproportionate impact. So that is the ultimate goal of the environmental justice law, is to ask ourselves again, are some communities, based on who they are, based on their income, based on their minority status, based on their LEP status, experiencing more of their fair share of pollution than others? And to determine if there's a disproportionate impact and to avoid it. And so a disproportionate impact can be two scenarios. It can be when a facility will come in and contribute to there being a disproportionate impact, or a community is already experiencing more than their fair share of pollution. There's already disproportionality there, and the community will still come in and contribute to there being still a disproportionate instance there. And so our goal is to avoid both. So the department has a decision to make. After we call together all of the comments and everything that we've heard at the public hearing, we have the authority now to make a decision on the facility's application. And so if a disproportionate impact can be avoided, remember that's our goal, then that's great. The department will authorize the facility to proceed. We will authorize them to proceed through the process of establishing and gaining the rest of the permits that they need to be able to successfully operate the facility. But we'll set some conditions to make sure that that facility is remaining in avoiding that disproportionate impact. Now, if a disproportionate impact cannot be avoided, the department has two options. So for new facilities, we are required to deny those permits. So if you can't avoid a disproportionate impact, and remember, we give you the environmental justice impact statement as an opportunity to explore ways to avoid and minimize those contributions of pollution. But if the facility says we can't avoid it, and it's a new, brand new facility, the department will deny that permit. Now, for existing facilities that are already located within overburdened communities, or for facilities that are going to expand their operations in some way, we do not have the authority to deny those permits, but we can set conditions on those permits that further reduce and minimize and avoid contributions to pollution. And so I'm not going to get too much into conditions and the process for our environmental justice impact statement, because we are very lucky to have our director of our permitting office, who's going to talk to us about more of those specifics. So I'll pass that to him. But I do just want to leave you all with some information and some links about what I've shared. There are presentations and tutorials and flowcharts and a lot of good information that really breaks down in a lot of detail our environmental justice law and the process that I just described. So with that, I thank you for appeasing me and this overview of the EJ law. And I think next up, we're going to take a break. And then we'll transition to Dave Pepe, who's going to talk more about some of the specifics of our environmental justice impact statement and conditions. So off to a break, and people are coming back at what time? And I'll be back to let you know what time we're coming back for folks of you online. Thanks. 10-minute break. In the room here, folks were just having some light conversation and eating some food, some refreshments. So hopefully you at home have some dinner or some refreshments that you're snacking on while we continue. So I'm going to pass the baton and the floor over to my colleague in a minute, but there's two questions or three, a few questions that came online. And so I want to make sure that we take a minute to just answer those, and we'll have time for discussion and Q&A when Dave Pepe does his talk next. And so Jim Grant online is asking, is the lack of opportunity to recreate a stressor? So yes, it is a stressor. It's included under those that may cause public health impacts. And so if you were not to have open space or the opportunity to recreate in open space, that can cause public health impacts like obesity, for example. And so, yes, we do count that as a stressor. Another question is from Nicole Miller, and she asks, to date, has the law been used to deny or revise any permits under consideration? So the answer to that is no, not yet. We've not had that scenario happen. And that's mostly because our environmental justice regulations, so the regulations that the DEP is required to adopt in order to implement the law, were adopted on April 17th last year, 2023. So the law was signed in 2020. The rules were adopted about 2.5 years later, April 17th, 2023. And so in that gap period, Dave will talk about this a little bit more. We have an administrative order process that covers that gap. Projects that are received after April 17th, 2023 is what is subject to those environmental justice regulations. So we don't have the authority to deny permits outright under the administrative order, only under the environmental justice regulations. And to date, we only have a handful of applicants that are subject to the environmental justice regulations, and those processes will be carrying out pretty soon. So stay tuned for those public hearings and to read and comment on those environmental justice impact statements. And another question is from Jim Grant, and he's saying, how can a community that is adjacent to a defined overburdened community, but itself is not overburdened, able to protect itself from disproportionate impacts? Is there some kind of legal definition or right for adjacent communities? And so there is a definition within our regulations for adjacent. We define adjacent, and I'm going to get into this a little bit later in the agenda, is a community that has zero population. And so there is no definition for a community that has population to be considered adjacent. It's either you are an overburdened community or you're not. And adjacent overburdened communities with zero population, we do track those to make sure that facilities that are located within those adjacent overburdened communities are not unduly impacting the neighboring overburdened community. But that's not to say that you can't be talking with and establishing groups and task force and advocacy communities with all of the overburdened communities within your municipality, even if you yourself do not live in one. Because if you're advocating for good decisions within your municipality that should have broad benefits across the municipality, regardless of where you specifically live. And so I just want to do a time check are we set for Dave? Okay, we're set for Dave. I think there's a few more questions coming in and we'll have some time a little bit later. And so I want to pass it over to Dave Pepe. He is the director of our Office of Permitting and Project Navigation within the DEP and plays a critical role in helping the DEP to implement the environmental justice law. So he's going to take us through a lot more of the elements and the mechanics and the specifics and present you with some really good information and tips and tricks for when it's time for you to come to the table and have your say about the facilities going through the environmental justice law. So Dave, thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Pepe. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Commissioner. So I am going to be talking about environmental justice impact statement. But before I begin, just a quick background of our office. Our office is unique in the department. I know the Commissioner talked about all the permitting aspects of what DEP does. And our Office of Permitting and Project Navigation, if you're used to those media areas, those four major, right? We think of air, water, and land. Our office, we deal with all of them, right? So our office is very unique in the department where we look at all permits for proposals that are in front of us. So that's why environmental justice projects go through our office, because we evaluate and look at all the authorizations that we're facing, right? So that's the key component of our office. Now, with that, our office is not a siloed office, right? We work very closely with Office of Environmental Justice and also the Office of Legal Affairs. And when I think of these evaluations, those three offices are the ones that have the initial look, right? So that's a key component of why it's unique. And back to how the department worked in the past and with patients, right? This is a brand new. Everything we're talking about today has never been done before. We are learning just as much through this process as all of you. And we need that feedback to evaluate, A, are we doing a good enough job? And more importantly, how can we do this better? And I think that's critical for community engagement. And what we hear with that feedback is what can we do to make this better and what can we do to improve it? So we're walking this path all together, right? I hope you understand that we're looking for your influence here with us to make that change happen, because it doesn't happen overnight. And it's a very difficult process, but through this, and we're hoping with more engagements like this, we're going to get better and better and better, right? Okay. So a little background back to what Candace was speaking about earlier. We had the law first. In order for that law to be fully implemented, it needed the regulations. The regulations were not adopted yet. So what we call the gap. The gap between the law and the regs is the administrative order. That administrative order was signed by Commissioner LaTourette in 2021. And when I think about the AO, as we love acronyms at DEP, so I'll try to explain the acronyms when I say it. So the AO, the administrative order, we spent about 2 years under that process, and we learned a lot through that process. And I call the AO the rule light, is the light version of the rule. It gets us close to the rule, but it is not the rule. So the key components of the AO, when I go back to facility type listed under the law, right? And the OBC, I always talk about the big three. When I talk about the big three, is the proposal has to be within an OBC, a facility type listed under the law, and an application type. Application type has to be an individual permit. And I know you're going to hear a terminology and you're probably thinking to yourself online, what is an individual permit? Individual permit is just that. It's an individual authorization for that facility. It is not what we call a general permit, which is a generalized permit for many of similar facilities. So I'll give you a good example. If I own a quarry, right? And I'm a quarry owner, there may be 30 other quarries in New Jersey that have similar operations that have limited, reduced impacts that meet conditions for a general permit that authorizes all 30 of those facilities. If one facility can't meet that general permit requirement, they get an individual permit, right? So that has to be all three. It has to be within an OBC, facility type listed in the law, and an individual permit. And if you hear an acronym IP, because we love acronyms, it's individual permit. Then we have the rule, right? The regulations. Those were adopted April 17th. And any application that came in prior is under the AO. And I know a lot of you are wondering, does the AO go away? It does not go away until it's sunsetted out and we have no more administrative order projects. But the department has many projects and many applications that still backdate to that prior to April 17th. So a couple key components. What's the difference, right, of the AO versus the rule? The AO is a 60-day public comment period. The AO was a virtual only hearing. You could do it in person if you could. It was during COVID, so we made it virtual only as an option. You could do a hybrid option under the AO. And the important piece is an aegis is not required on the administrative order, and the DEP did not have the authority to deny those projects. If you shift gears into the rule has a 90-day comment period. It has you have to have it within that community in person or hybrid. And an aegis is required, environmental justice impact statement is required And the department has that authority to deny those applications if it's based on a new facility or new source. All right. Some terminology to know. I can't see what that top one is. Hold on. Environmental justice, right? Fair and treatment of meaningful involvement of all people, right? So remember, this goes back to if you've ever been to a public hearing prior. Public hearings for DEP are solely based on the authorization in front of that community specific to that environmental immediate area. So if you went to an air authorization public hearing, the public hearing comments are related to that air authorization. That is not the case for environmental justice projects. Every voice is heard, every comment matters, and it is on anything that is of a concern, right? That's the critical part. That's why it's the community engagement, those comments across the board. All right. And an overburdened community, back to what Candace was speaking about before, is defined under the law and also defined through our EJ mapping tool that Candace will go over shortly. These are the facility types. So we talk about the big three, right? The OBC, overburdened community, facility type listed under the law. Major source of air pollution. If you ever hear the term Title V, right? That's a famous Title V air, that's a major source of air pollution. Incinerators, resource recovery facilities, sludge processing facilities, large treatment plants over 50 MGD or million gallons per day, transfer stations or solid waste facilities that take at least 100 tons, scrap metal facilities, landfills, and medical waste incinerators. Those are our facilities listed under the law. Go ahead.
What about with the warehouses and everything? If they don't have tenants, they don't know what they're going to be, but they want to build affordable housing in the middle of an industrial park, and you don't know what it's going to be. How would that site be?
It's a great question, right? So
What's going on in my community, right? One of my
yes. So it all comes back to application type, right? So, oh, I'm sorry. The question was if a warehouse went into your development or went into your community and you don't know yet what the impact's going to be, I think the question is, would it trigger environmental justice, right? It's basically the question. It comes back to the big three. Obviously, if you're an OBC, you got the one. Facility type. Is that warehouse one of these facility types? That's the question. And you don't know. And we wouldn't know either until we got an application. So that's where, if an application came in for that warehouse, and let's say that warehouse was a major, had a major refrigerator component to it, major HVAC system, right? A system that uses lots of energy. And through that energy, they emit a threshold above into a major source category, it would be captured. If they're below that threshold, they may not meet the facility type. That's a great question. It all depends on the application in front of the department.
Does it include affordable housing? You know, affordable housing sometimes bypasses environmental ordinances. But if you're actually building, we're actually building an industrial park, and in the center of it, they're putting affordable housing and no inclusionary housing.
Okay, so the question is, affordable housing trigger the law, right, or trigger the regulations? I do not believe that would meet a facility type.
Would the warehouses would not be the facility type?
Well, I don't know, right? It had to be
Yeah.
based on the application, but it comes down to, would that warehouse meet a major source of air pollution?
Okay.
So it's tricky. I know the answer is tough, right? So
Yeah.
I'll get more into detail on that, but remember the big three. That application type is critical.
Okay.
Does that proposal come into the department for an authorization, an individual authorization that would meet these conditions of these 8 types? Does that warehouse, is it a major source of air? Is it an incinerator? Is it a
Right.
sludge process, right? That's
Planning gets hard when there's no tenants and they're just
Right.
building, and then sometimes they sit empty and who knows what they could be. And it could be just a bounce house, play recreation site, which is great, but, or it could be something with 700 trucks per day, and
correct.
that's upsetting to see.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right.
Because
You
then you
know-
have increased asthma rates for people who are already impacted.
Agreed. Yes. So if it did, let's say it did,
Mhm.
right? If it did meet that, one of these facility types and the application type, it would be under the law.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
Okay. More terminology, adverse stressors, a stressor that is higher than the geological point of comparison. We will go into more detail on that when you do the EJ mapping tool. Clock stops, right? The clock stopping. This is another key component of the regulations. No authorization can go through until the EJ portion is done. What that means is the application comes into the department. We realize, back to your question, we realize it triggered the law. It is under an EJ project through our office. It needs to have an aegis. It needs to have public comment, needs to have full evaluation, conditions applied as we get there. But the key component is those applications in the department stop. The clock is stopped until that process is concluded. It's the first time I've ever done something like this. Let me tell you, the background on how to make that work is pretty hard, right? But the clock stopped. There is no permit that's going to go out until the EJ process is concluded. Disproportionate impact. Remember, it goes back to the cumulative impacts, another evaluation we've never done before in the department, taking in everything around it, back to the commissioner's analogy of the stamp book. That's that, right? We evaluate that stamp book. Permit shield. That's a tricky one, right? We get this question a lot. Now, permit shield is a terminology used in the department when an authorization is up for a renewal, say, right? Say they're up for a renewal cycle is usually 5 years in the department. And back to those authorizations, and I know maybe the commissioner hinted on this before, but there are many programs that issue many permits for one said project. And remember, the key goal of the department has always been and always will be where environmental impacts happen, avoid, minimize, and if you can't do those two, mitigate. That's the department's goal. Environmental justice, you cannot mitigate, right? So that's back to that cultural shift of how we evaluate these. So now we're looking at strictly avoid and minimize where we can. Permit shields come into play when an authorization has been issued for several years, and maybe they're under a renewal process, and there might be a federal condition that's not in an authorization, or it might be under an administrative consent order, or it might have penalties associated with it. So that permit goes on the side, right? It's under a shield until we can figure out a means of making that permit through the next cycle. It's a really confusing terminology, but it's an old dated term. But what that means is it's authorized in existing conditions that are not new renewals. That permit's been, say it's been 5, 6 years old under those previous conditions. It remains until we can get to the point where we can renew it with new conditions. Usually it's tied to some federal requirement. The issue with some permit shields through environmental justice process is we need to tie it to a permit that we have in-house, an individual permit. If it's under the permit shield, it's difficult to issue that authorization. So the goal is, or the fix, is those special conditions apply on top of every authorization to the department. At the end of the day, with that decision document with conditions in it from the commissioner, signed from the commissioner himself, that lays on top of all the other authorizations in the department. So I know we get this a lot. If there is a permit shield that the community is worried about, those conditions apply regardless if they're under a permit shield or not. Okay. I know it's confusing. That's a hard one. Oh. Okay. Did I miss this one? Ah. Yeah. All right. Environmental justice impact statement. What is it, right? We go back to what Candace was speaking about before, and it is a document. It is a public facing document that describes the proposal. It describes the health conditions that the overburdened community faces, the public health stressors associated with that the facility type, the potential effects of the facility on the surrounding environment community, and how the facility can avoid, reduce, and or minimize those stressors. That's the key part. And how did they evaluate those disproportionate impacts? How did they review that collective stamp book? That impact statement, for those that have looked at other environmental impact statements, which ties back to the federal requirement under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, they also have impact statements, right? So the federal governments have that framework of what an impact statement is, and it's evaluation. Here, it is an environmental justice evaluation that gets, back to Candace's point, gets posted publicly. It goes on our website, DEP's website, specifically environmental justice. It can and should go on the facility's website if available. It also gets published in a public location, usually, the town hall or public library. That is the key part of evaluating what that facility is doing and what they're doing to avoid those impacts, minimize those impacts. And the key part of the environmental justice impact statement is what can the department do to better the product, right? What can we do collectively, not just department, but the community members as well, to allow us that engagement of what are we missing? That's an environmental justice impact statement. That is what should be happening. Okay. What's in it? The facility is required to prepare the aegis when the regulations are triggered. This goes back to the facility, the big three. Facility has to be in an OBC, has to be one of the major types, applying for the individual permit, right? It goes back to what I repeated before. Allows the DEP and the overburdened community to evaluate what effects the facility will have on the environment, health, and safety of the community. Gives the opportunity to ensure facilities minimize and avoid adverse impacts. That's a collective effort, right? So when this impact statement comes in and we post it, the three groups in the department get the initial review. Our Office of OPPN, Permitting and Project Navigation, Environmental Justice, and Office of Legal Affairs. We're the initial look, right? We make sure everything is there. We start evaluating what sections go to further out the technical review of those evaluations. That's also the time when you should be looking at it. While we're doing that initial review, it's also your time to do that initial review and really study those impacts and really evaluate what's going in that facility, what's going in that community, and also evaluate what they could be doing better, what we could be doing better. That comes down to how we draft special conditions, okay? What's included is an executive summary, propose an existing facility location, including any mapping, a detailed description of the operations and the purpose, list of all federal, state, and local permits that need to be attained and required, evidence of satisfaction with any local government environmental justice or cumulative impact analysis, and the facility is required to comply with the law and the regulations. The initial screening, an assessment of environmental and public health impacts the facility will have, a public participation plan. That's another big one. They put the aegis out there. The public participation plan basically has the facility state how they're going to get the information to you. That's part of it. And remember the key part that I may have missed before, and I'm sorry. It's the facility's responsibility to do an aegis, right? This is on the facility. We are the evaluators of that impact statement. And also they're responsible for the public participation plan. How do they get that information that's in their hands and your hands? That's a public participation plan. An analysis of what operational control measures the facility can take to avoid disproportionate impacts. Another critical part of an aegis. What are they doing to reduce that? And if applicable, how the facility would serve a compelling public interest. I'll go into compelling public, I have another slide on it, but I'll go into it briefly now. A compelling public interest has to be approved by the department and it has to meet a community need. So let's say, for an example, a wastewater treatment plant has a combined sewer overflow, CSO impact that needs to be repaired. And through that repair, it triggers one of the facility types and is under the environmental justice regs. The facility would propose that they meet compelling public interest because it's beyond, it needs to get done for public health reasons. They still have to do everything I just talked about. The only difference is that the department would not have the ability to deny that, right? It has to meet that compelling public interest. I'll go into that in more detail, but I just wanted to briefly talk about that. The executive summary is a brief overview of the project. Again, what permits are applied for, including the permit numbers and titles, how the permit will improve the facility or the justification, why the environmental justice process applies, existing facility operations, description of the proposed project, including all required equipment, the facility location. This goes down to physical address, descriptions of the areas within 200 feet of the facility, including community dwellings, hospitals, nursing homes, playgrounds, and schools. Demographic and economic zoning, site location map, and water quality descriptions. You have a question?
Crap, what our community is doing. It's literally, there's just nothing but warehouses around them, and there is a park, but they're not building sidewalks on a 5-lane road. It just makes me nervous. And what's the future for the people that are living there? It's going to be people of color, single mothers, with children in an industrial complex. And I can't stop about it. It's awful.
I know, right? And we all see it, right? We all see that boom that's happening. And, right. And that goes to a good point. The question is about seeing massive amounts of warehouse development in your local community. And this is a little off topic, but right. So sure, let's address it, right? The whole point of these engagements is to talk about that. So back to Sean Lutz or Commissioner Lutzer's talk about, our regulatory authority, right? And it comes down to state impacts, right? And there is a whole other side that we're not talking about, which is local, right? Local approvals, local zoning. And if it does get to DEP, if something like that did get to DEP, it's vetted locally, right? Through zoning approvals, through all that approval process. Well, maybe, right?
I sure very
Right.
wealthy community, and Florence, Bordentown, and Mansfield all decided to put their low income down along the river, along Route 130. Sorry. So all the affordable housing.
The wireless, yeah.
Sorry. Take the time to let Dave finish, and we're gonna have again. Thanks.
No problem. So yes, there's a lot of back to the state impacts, right? Always remember, it's an excellent point. I think it's critical. I'll take it, right? I'll answer it now. Remember, DEP regulates state regulated areas, right? So that includes your wetlands, your flood hazard areas, state impacts, right? And if it's a zone, a local zoning, we rarely see them, right? So, and I know it's concerning to all of us, and you're heard. I absolutely hear you, right? Agreed. Okay, back to our aegis. Included in aegis is operations and purpose. This is what the existing facility includes: its hours, number of employees, on-site equipment, traffic routes. Remember, under environmental stressors, remember that truck traffic, right? That's evaluated. Environmental pollution monitoring equipment, environmental pollution control measures. What is the purpose of proposed project and permits? Back to anticipated construction plans and completion dates. That is critical pieces of information. You may not think of it now, but it's when do they want to turn the switches on, right? And when do they start construction? Remember, when we talk about impacts, it's construction and then operational impacts. Always remember when you do these evaluations, especially with an aegis on a project, there are two major phases, right? It's the construction, those impacts, and then when it operates, right? When it operates, construction, you think of how do they tie the infrastructure into this facility? What are they disturbing? How much land disturbance is it going to be? What is the dust when they start digging and using mobile equipment? Then when the facility is built, where does the waste go, right? Where does the water go? Those are things you got to think about. What's emitting from the air? So construction, operation. List of all permits, which includes federal, state, local. Ooh, I got to move this, sorry. Ooh. Environmental and public health impacts. This is where we, thank you. This is where you talk about your concentrated areas of air pollution, your mobile sources. Thank you. Contaminated sites, transfer stations and solid waste facilities, scrap facilities, point sorts of water pollution, potential public health impacts, density, proximity stressors, and social determinants of health. And the OBC stressor summary is found on EJMAP, which Candace will go over shortly. Supplemental information. That initial aegis comes into the department, gets reviewed, and if the facility cannot avoid or demonstrate avoidance of disproportionate impact, a supplemental information is required. That also gets posted the same way that the aegis gets posted. Within that supplemental information, it's more of an assessment, right? It's further evaluation of what's going on. It's your localized air quality data, your groundwater data, assessment of climate and flooding impacts, traffic studies, sewage treatment facilities, stormwater treatment and collection, water supply information, assessment on energy demands, including renewable options, and alternative analysis for proposed new or expanding facilities. Just want to pause on that one. That's a critical part. An alternative analysis is used through the department on many authorizations, right? Mostly all individual permits that have a tremendous impact to the environment, right? An impact that it meets an individual permit. Under an aegis, we're using the same lens. We want to see what is the alternative to this facility? Has the facility looked at alternatives? That's what an alternative analysis is. It's, do you have to build it here? Is a question from the first alternative analysis. Why? So that is critical when it comes to supplemental information. Odor, dust, and noise mitigation or management plans, control measures proposed, and a detailed compliance history for the facility. Okay. The public participation plan. This goes back to how does the aegis get into your hands? It must conduct a public hearing within the OBC, present their aegis. Public hearing is to ensure the OBC is informed on the facility's operations and gives the public a chance to comment on the project before a decision is made. The plan requirements include a sign advising about the permit application, where and when the public hearing will take place. Published in 2 newspapers that service that OBC, including a secondary language. Property owners and residents within 200 feet must be given notice of the public hearing by certified mail. And again, the 90-day comment period. What's not on here is that we post all of these on Office of Environmental Justice website. They also go on our DEP bulletin, just like any other permit authorization would have. Okay. Alternative analysis shows an assessment of all other reasonable alternatives to the project that the applicant is proposing. This allows the applicant and the public a chance to evaluate the cost and operation feasibility of any alternatives. Compelling public interest. Facility serves an essential environmental health or safety need of the OBC. The facility is necessary to serve an essential environmental health or safety need, and there's no other reasonable alternative to meet the environmental health or safety need. So it's pretty critical. Compelling public interest has to meet some pretty high goals, right? And remember, back to the department has to grant that compelling public interest. We have to say, yes, it meets compelling public interest. It goes through the same process. The only difference is that permit could not be denied, right? That's the only outstanding condition. There would not be an authority in the department to deny. Special conditions. So what happens after all of this, right? The EJS gets evaluated, special condition gets evaluated. It goes through multiple levels of the department. And back to that department review, it is not just the 3 offices' role. It's a department-wide effort to evaluate this. This EJS goes to every program that it hits. Air, water, solid waste, land. All the programs look at this. It's a department-wide effort. So DEP, under the law and under the first time these regulations, we can issue special conditions on all authorizations to avoid, reduce, or minimize those impacts to the community. Those special conditions apply on top of every authorization. It is signed by the commissioner himself. It gets drafted, goes through the process like any other permit. And just remember, it goes on top of all of them. All right. So that's why we need community engagement to help write those special conditions. So I gave a couple examples of what would a special condition be: a dust management plan, an odor control plan, reduction of emissions, right? Back to that state of the art. What can the facility do they have not done before that they can do now to better? And what can the department do that we have not done before that we can do better? That's the point of a special condition. Where to find the EJS? Again, it's all posted on Environmental Justice Impact Statement. It's all posted on the Office of Environmental Justice website. The applicant can post it on their local community areas, also on their website if applicable. And it's also on the bulletin. How to comment on an EJS. All public comments must be submitted to the facility. It's the facility's responsibility to collect and receive all those comments. It is also the facility's responsibility to respond to those comments. No comment is to be ignored. Every comment is heard. That goes back to this unique change of the culture of public hearings, right? This is the first time, right? This is every comment is heard from anybody. Has to be addressed, has to be listened to, has to be collected. If you're not comfortable submitting those comments to the facility, we will take your comment. Candace will take the comment. I will take the comment. Okay? How to phrase your comments. This is a little bit into your presentation, I think, right? Oh, okay, never mind. Okay, how is it? Comments that are helpful. Always remember, use specifics. Example would be if you just, for example, if you said it smells, right? When does it smell? How does it smell? Those are comments that are effective. If you say, I smell rotten egg in the morning, sulfur or methane, right? When did you smell it? What time? Did you notice dust on your car when you took your children to school in the school bus? Was it not there at night? Those are things that we need because they're specific and they help us evaluate what's going on in that facility. And specifically what time, right? That's critical. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask the facility. And evaluate that whole aegis before submitting your comments. That's the point of that aegis is to give you the information so you understand, so we understand, and then you can address your comments because you fully addressed or fully reviewed the information in front of you. You can reach out to guidance if you need guidance on how to effectively phrase your comments. Environmental justice can help you with that. OPPN can help you with that. We're here to help you. If you have trouble with compiling your comment, we can help guide you with that. This is where you get the notifications for upcoming meetings. Back to environmental justice website. It's under the attend a meeting link. It's a little drop down. You could do attend a meeting, scroll down to EJ Law public hearings, and it's by county. The first is by, if you notice a couple highlighted ones in the beginning, that's because they're coming up, right? So if they're within a couple weeks, they're right there, right on the posted page. And then if you don't find it, sort by county. You could sign up for notifications. This is how you do it. I won't go into it too much, but basically you put your email in, and anytime that county gets a notification, it scrapes this website. So anytime a new post gets into that county, you get an email, right? It'll say there's something new on Salem County. And here's just a links back to Candace's links again. And also for any questions or guidance, you can reach out to Candace or myself. Happy to address any comments and questions. I know that was a lot, so I'm sorry I took up so much time, but I wanted to be thorough as possible. But if there's any questions, I could stay on the podium until we conclude. 5 minutes?
Yeah.
All right, let's hit the chat. Oh, I could see it. I think I could see it, yeah. Hold on, I see him. Okay, hold on, I'm just scrolling up. Oh, okay, great. I think the first question, want me to take it until you figure that out?
Check.
This is from Kevin Barfield.
Testing.
Oh, go ahead. Yep.
So one question is from T. Taylor. Is there any authority that NJDEP has when it comes to addressing indirect air pollution from trucks? For example, that travel to and from NJ ports, warehouse facilities, and close to nearby communities, et cetera?
Was it evaluating trucks? Is that the question?
Does NJDEP have authority when it comes to indirect air pollution from trucks, for example?
So yes, we have, yes. Mobile Sources is that particular program that evaluates mobile sources, which includes diesel emitting trucks. However, specifically related to an aegis, yes, that is a stressor, right? We would evaluate that. Specifically, where are the trucks coming in? Where are they leaving? And what route are they taking? And how many? So yes, that is taken into consideration under an aegis and also under our evaluation for cumulative impacts. Oh yeah, correct. Yeah, thank you, Candace. Yes, and that could be applied as a special condition to reroute trucks, limit those amount of trucks that they receive or go out. Correct. We would evaluate that and if appropriate, would apply a special condition to that type of facility. Yes.
This question is also from T. Taylor. This is in regards to the EJ mapping tool. They want to know if the DEP could include warehouse facilities in the EJ mapping tool.
We get that question a lot. Yes. So a warehouse is not one of the 8 type of facilities listed under the law. However, if that warehouse was one of those type of facilities, for instance, if it was a major source, then it would be captured. But a warehouse in general is not a facility type. It would be based on the 8 facility types, and if it fell into one of those 8. Okay.
This is the last question from Danielle. What's an example of something that's been denied, a facility where the environmental impacts can't be lessened?
So the answer to that is we have not denied any application yet, right? So this is all brand new. And I think we have about six that have come into the department. However, only 1 has finalized an aegis. The other 5 are working on drafting their aegis, and the department has offered to evaluate draft aegis to make sure everything is there before it's posted publicly. But we have a boilerplate of what has to be in an aegis, and those facilities are working through that template that we provided. However, it's not ready to be published because they're still working on finalization. So when a facility is ready to finalize their aegis, they have to go through our DEP portal. It goes through the whole process that a normal application would come in, and then it gets posted on the website. So there is currently 1 facility that has a final aegis for review on OEJ's website. One more, okay.
And this one is a comment from Kevin. Let me just find it real quick. Kevin Barfield says, I'm confused that existing facilities can continue to expand in an overburdened community, especially when multiple polluting industries / stressors are present.
Well, yeah, that's the point of EJ, right? We hear you, right? We understand. And that is evaluated, right? An expansion triggers the law and the regulations. That critically meets the definition of an EJ regulation trigger, right? If one of those 8 type facilities came in as an expansion, it would be in an OBC, would be one of the facility types, and would need an application to expand. An expansion always includes new impacts. New impacts always need an authorization. So we would grab that. Now, I think his question is, can we deny an expansion? It's probably where they're going with that. And the way that works is, depending on what type of expansion it is, if the department deemed that expansion a new source, then it would be a new application and potentially a new source. And that could be a possibility for denial if that facility could not meet the regs, right? They did not meet that disproportionate impact and did not meet their alternative analysis. And those impacts did impact that community, then we could, right? That's the point. The point is we're looking at that. We didn't look at that before. And now we're looking at that. So I agree, like that is why we're doing this. However, like the commissioner said, it doesn't happen overnight. And we need all of your help to make sure that we are looking at that and doing what we can, where we can. I hope that answered that. I know that's hard. Good? All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Dave. You shared a lot of good information with the audience, so I hope that was helpful to you all. Please continue to reach out to Dave if you have specific follow-up questions. He'd be happy to have some ongoing conversations with you all. So moving on in our agenda, I want to bring up one of my colleagues, Rehana Azimi, who is the Community Relations Specialist within the Office of Environmental Justice. And she's going to talk about the public participation requirements under the environmental justice law and give you all some best practices as food for thought. So, Rihanna. Yeah, it's fine. Oh, okay, great. Okay, good evening. Thank you. Thank you guys for being here online and in person. So like Candace said, I'm going to talk to you all about the public participation requirements under the environmental justice rule. So today I'm going to go over a few different components in detail about what permit applicants are required to do in this process. So first off, we have posting a public notice. Before you can have a meeting, the applicants need to post publicly a notice. And this is just kind of like a text document that outlines, what's going to happen, what the meeting date is, and all those details. And then this will happen before the public hearing can happen. So this is like about the process for how it has to be posted. So at least 60 days prior to any public hearing, the permit applicant needs to first provide a copy of the environmental justice statement to the clerk of the local municipality or municipalities in which the OBC is located. They need to publish this notice in at least 2 newspapers circulating within the overburdened community, one of which should be a non-English language newspaper if that's applicable. They also need to provide written notice of this hearing to DEP and the clerk of the municipality in which the overburdened community is located. They also need to provide written notice of the hearing through certified mail to all people who own or reside on lands located within 200 feet of the facility. Dave spoke about a few of these items, so this might be hearing it again, but they also have to post and maintain a sign on the site of the facility, provide notice through other methods to ensure direct and adequate notice to community members. And then this includes inviting the department, municipality, and local environmental groups to the public hearing. So these are the bare bones requirements for doing outreach. Of course, there's a lot more that a permit applicant can and should do, and I'll talk towards the end of my presentation about some guidelines that we're creating to share our best practices. So what needs to be in this notice? So in the law, applicants are required to put their basic info, like it has to include their name, the date, time, and location of the hearing, a description of what this new or expanded facility will be,
a map of the location, a summary of the aegis, and information on how someone may review a copy of the completed aegis, an invitation to the public hearing, like it might be a Zoom link or something like that. And then it should tell people when the comment period will start and how they might submit comments, and then any other information that we might deem appropriate, because we can ask them to include some things. So requirements for holding a public hearing. One, they have to be held in the community, in the overburdened community in which the proposed facility will be. It has to be conducted on a weekday and no earlier than 6 p.m. They're required to be in person with a virtual component, so all of them should be hybrid. And they have to be recorded and available online for the public to view after the hearing. They have to provide clear, accurate, and a complete presentation of information in the aegis and any other supplemental information. During the hearing, they have to accept written and oral comment and allow time for people to testify if they want. So the comment period will begin 30 days before the public hearing, and it has to be a minimum of 30 days. So it'll be, and then 30 days after the public hearing. So it'll be no less than 60 days total. So what happens after the hearing? The permit applicant has to provide a written transcript and/or a recording of the hearing, a summary of all public comments they received, and their responses to the public comments. So even though people will be testifying at the meeting, at the hearing, they might not have answers to everything or will be able to answer. And so those answers will come after it already happens. And people can also comment after the hearing as well. I'll talk about that. So after the hearing, they must respond to comments and describe how they'll address them. As necessary, they might amend and republish the aegis. And if the applicant makes a material change to the information in the aegis based on this process, then we'll require them to amend the aegis to reflect the change and restart the process, conducting another public notice and public hearing. So how do you find information? I think we did already talk a little bit about this, but on our website, you can find the public notice and the aegis. You can also find out how, through that public notice, how you can provide comments or find out when the meeting is, so then you can ask questions or testify. The same place where you find the public notice, there'll also be posted the hearing recording and information on the responses to comments. So like David said in the previous presentation, you can reach out to us if you have questions, if you're not finding something, if you don't understand something on the website, and we'll be available to talk to you or try to answer your questions. So this was also shared in the previous presentation, but it's good to hear it again. So this is where you find on the DEP website, attend a meeting, you click there. And then if you scroll down, you can click on one of the drop-down bars and find out where the notices are, and that location is also find the recordings and the aegis and those documents. And then this is just an example of a recent public notice. And so this is not one that's under the EJ law, but under the administrative order. And so there might be more different information in one of those, but basically there's a Zoom link and an email that you can submit comments to. So that's kind of what you're looking for.
Should hold that for a second?
Sure.
So, I just bring up some good points here, right? So remember, the public notice for, oh, oh yeah, sorry.
You could use this one.
Thanks. So what Brianna's pointing out is pretty critical, right? Here's a public notice, a typical notice under the AO, which not going to look much different under the rule. But do you notice that they call out, what we want to do is within the body of the notice, it tells you what's going on. It intends to hold a public information session, right? That's piece number one. Number two is a brief summary of that project. And notice they call out, they're a major Title V facility, major air pollution, right? So that's, you're in an OBC, here's the notice, your facility type, number two, and then where to go, right? And when does the comment period start? 60-day comment period starting January 15th, ending March 18th. There's your 60-day notice, right? So that's all what she's trying to point out is they're all posted. The aegis is also posted and all the important documents are also posted. Response to comments, department review, department decision will all be on the same webpage, all right? Sorry.
Thank you for that clarification or highlight. I'll just hold it. And if you look on the back of the agenda, there's a QR code so you can sign up for automatic notifications by county and be notified whenever that's updated. So that QR code I just mentioned, it's on the back of the agenda, or you could take one or just explore our EJ website. And we'll send it electronically to participants who are online or participants who registered. And you could also sign up for our newsletter. So in our biweekly newsletter, we also include updates like this about upcoming public hearings. So in addition to these requirements, we're creating some tools to supplement this public participation process. So one is guidelines for applicants that fall under the EJ law so that they can know what we kind of expect out of the process. So out of the notification, the outreach process, and a public hearing. And we'll publish those on our website. We're also creating a directory of environmental justice advocates. And so the idea with this is that if you are interested in being directly notified about any upcoming meetings, you can put your name and email in our directory, which will be publicly posted on our website. So any facility permit applicant that wants to notify people will say, okay, I'm doing a meeting in this town or county. I'll take all the emails from that area and notify them directly about this upcoming meeting and hearing. And if you want to be, it's not launched yet. So if you want to join, please send an email to the EJ email, which is also on the back of the agenda, and we'll follow up with people about that too. So that is my presentation. Are there any questions?
I have a question. I understand for the public notice. For the public notice, they have to include it in a non-English publication. But for the rest of the process, is there any obligation for them to be aware of whatever the predominant language is in the community that they're in? As an example, if you can imagine if it's mostly a Spanish-speaking community, are they gonna make the aegis available in Spanish? Are they gonna have somebody available at the public hearing that speaks Spanish so that those people that only speak Spanish can be heard?
That's a good question. David's nodding yes, so I'm guessing yes.
Good question. Yes. So the under the administrative order, we learned a lot about that process, right? So a couple things, or hiccups, I should say. One thing we learned is not many newspapers still are available, right? So we learned that. However, we did go through the process of not making, right? The rule you're required, you do have to do it in another language. On the AO, it wasn't a requirement, it was highly recommended. And most facilities, 99% of them went through that recommendation. So what we did was during those public hearings, we had breakout rooms, and those breakout rooms had additional languages in that community, right? So we had one example, it was Portuguese and Spanish. There were 2 breakout rooms. And also we had it transcribed during the hearing through using AI. Under the rule, you are required, right? So when you publish that aegis, if there's another language that is confirmed in an OBC, that has to be posted in that language. So we're trying to get as many people that information as accessible as possible. Oh, this is the wrong link.
All right, thank you. We'll transition to Candace for our final presentation. Wait, how do you hide that? Sorry. What happened going on?
Okay, so I'm back and I'm here to close us out for the night with an overview and a tutorial of how to use our EJ map. So we talked a lot about definitions and the process and all of the mechanisms for our environmental justice law and our regulations. But now I'm going to talk to you about how do we visualize where the state's overburdened communities and environmental justice communities are located and how we use that information in the whole process. So to do that, we've created our environmental justice mapping assessment and protection tool, or EJMAP. And so when you log on to EJMAP, you'll see 2 or 4 tabs along the top of your screen. So the first is an introductory tab. You can scroll down and get a lot of good background information about the creation of the law and the regulations and how it works. It's not advancing. Okay. Oh, maybe I have to press it. Okay. All right. And so I included this slide earlier because we're talking about disproportionality and disproportionate impacts. And so our EJ map tool not only allows us to visualize where overburdened communities are and where environmental justice communities are, but it helps us to see where there are pockets of disproportionate pollution. And so the way that our tool works is it talks about adversity and disproportionality and stressors. but it does a cumulative impact analysis. It's going to look at the multiplicity of multiple sources within a community. And we're going to total those stressors. And we're going to compare those stressors in the overburdened community to the community's neighbor or their geographic point of comparison, some terminology we'll get into shortly. Okay, so remember, this is our definition of an overburdened community. And our OBCs are defined at the block group level. I said that earlier, the block group level, but I want to spend just a minute to explain what I mean by that. So a block group is a geographic unit that the US Census will provide data for. And so if you think about a block, like the street that you live on, a block group is going to be a collection of residential blocks. And it usually has between like 600 to 3,000 people within that block group. If you scale up from there, you have a block and then a block group and then a census tract, and then a zip code, a municipality, a county, and then a state. So we're talking about that block group level here when we talk about the EJMAP and the analysis within EJMAP. Okay, so back to, I included this slide before about environmental justice communities. I'm going to show you the difference on EJMAP, how we're visualizing OBCs and how we're visualizing the nexus of this Venn diagram that I talked about, which is an environmental justice community. When you're layering on top that disproportionate pollution and lack of benefits on top of OBCs, you can see both within EJMAP. So let's focus on the second tab of EJMAP. It's called Overburdened Communities. So if you click on this, you can see a color-coded legend where you have this tealish green color. So those are where all of the overburdened communities at the block group level are located throughout the state. If we zoom in a bit closer, I've included just the DEP headquarters building, the 401 East State Street, where I'm standing today, as an example that will take you through for EJMAP. And so you'll see that the building where we're located right now is within an overburdened community, is in that teal color. You'll also see adjacent in that mustardy yellow. So this goes back to a question that we got earlier in the day about adjacent block groups and what does that mean? So we are tracking, and you can see in EJMAP where those adjacent block groups are. They are block groups that are defined by the US Census as having zero population. And so I'll give you an example. A zero population block group would be like a port. So a port has zero population because no one lives at the port. But at the port, you could have a power plant. You know, you could have sources of pollution, which could be defined as a facility under the EJ law and could require an authorization from the department. And so as to not overlook those potential facilities that could potentially generate pollution and then cause pollution to and then cause a neighboring OBC to be impacted by that pollution, we are also tracking adjacent block groups. So block groups with zero population that are adjacent to an overburdened community, as to make sure that we're still providing comprehensive protection under the law and the rules. Okay, zooming in a bit closer, you're also able to see the multiple combinations and permutations of how a block group is determined to be an OBC based on its criteria. So if you go back to that definition I showed a little bit earlier, you only need to meet one of the three criteria: income, minority, and LEP, to be determined to be an OBC. So you can see OBCs that are determined OBC because they are low income, because they are low income and minority, because they are all three, or some combination of the three. On our third tab, our facilities tab, you can see all of the subject facilities across the state. So when I say subject, I mean the facilities that are defined a facility under the environmental justice law. Remember, there are 8 types. So you can be a recycling facility or a major source of air pollution with a Title V permit, or an incinerator or a landfill in one of those 8 types. So all of those are designated with a special icon. It might be a circle, it might be a triangle, but you can see where those are located throughout the state. So you're able to go in and type in your address, and see what is adjacent to you, like which sources of facilities are impacting your community, for example. Now, I want to move into what I call like the meat of our EJ map, and that's our fourth tab along the top. It's called stressor summary. So this is where you can visualize where our environmental justice communities are located throughout the state. So on the stressor summary tab, those are where your EJ communities are. And back here on your overburdened communities tab, this is where your OBCs are based on demographics. So if I live in a low-income Black community that doesn't speak English very well, that in and of itself is not an environmental justice community. It's whether or not that low-income Black community that doesn't speak English very well is experiencing more than their fair share of pollution. So the question is, how does EJMAP determine what is more than their fair share of pollution? And that's through our environmental and public health stressors. So I walked you through this earlier. I won't go through it, but we have all of the stressors listed in the back end of EJMAP. And so I've included charts like these so you can see the stressor and so you can see the source of the data, just in case you're interested. But there are 26 stressors. And here's the summary that I showed earlier. Okay, so if you keep our example of DEP's headquarters building, 401 East State Street, and you click on the block group in which it's located, so it's outlined in that teal color, you're gonna get a pop-up box. You wanna click to expand the pop-up box, and then you're gonna see a link, a hyperlink. You wanna click on it, it says download data table. When you click on that link that says download data table, you're gonna get a PDF pop-up. And in this PDF pop-up, this is all of the information and the data that's explaining and calculating behind the scenes how this one overburdened community in particular is higher than the 50th percentile. So what does that mean? I'm gonna break it down for you. On this PDF, you'll have all of the 26 stressors located. And so this is just a screenshot. I'm just showing you the first like 10 to 12 or so. But if you were to scroll down further online, you'll see all 26 listed. So let's take us through just an example, and we'll take you through the first stressor that's listed. It says ground level ozone 3-year average days above standard. And so if you look at the circle in blue, we're looking at the value for this one block group. So basically what this means is it says for this one block group, how many days above standard, how many average days above standard within a 3-year period is the level above, or sorry, let me start again. Within a 3-year period, what is the average number of days where the ground level ozone value is above standard? So the value for this one block group is 2.667. So it's saying the average number of days is 2.667 where the ground level ozone value is above standard. And so we want to compare that, right? Because again, our question is this block group experiencing more than their fair share of ground level ozone? That's our question. In order to determine that, we need a geographic point of comparison. We need to establish some way to compare this block group's value to another. And so the DEP has determined like, well, okay, a good way to answer that question is to look at the values in the county and to look at the values in the state. So we want to compare the county and the state at the non-OBC 50th percentile. So what does that mean? If we compare this one overburdened block group to all of the non-overburdened block group within the county first. So we have overburdened block groups and we have non-overburdened block groups. Let's look at the ground level ozone value for the non-overburdened block groups, and let's line them all up from least to greatest. And we'll take the middle value. That's going to be your 50th percentile. And we're going to compare our block group's value in question, the 2.667, to the 50th percentile, or when we line them up from least to greatest and take the middle value, which is 2.33, that circle in red. And we're going to ask ourselves, between the circle in red and the same value for the state, which is 0.99, what is the lower of the two? We're picking the lower of the two because we want to be most comprehensive. So we're going to say, okay, 0.99 is lower than 2.33, obviously. So that circle in green is going to be our geographic point of comparison. So we're comparing the overburdened block group in question to, again, the non-overburdened block groups in the county and the state. We're taking that middle value or that 50th percentile value, and we're comparing to say between the county and the state, which one is lower? In this example, the state is lower. So then we're going to ask ourselves, is the ground level ozone value for the block group 2.667 higher than or lower than the geographic point of comparison, which is 0.99? Obviously, 2.6 is higher than 0.99. So we're saying for this one stressor, it's a yes. This is an adverse stressor for this block group because it's higher than the geographic point of comparison at the 50th percentile. And so we'll just do that same calculation for all of the 26 stressors that exist. And so for some, you'll say yes, and for some, you'll do that math, and the answer will be no. Yes, no, yes, no. Our job next then is to count the total number of yeses. So I have highlighted in the chart above in yellow that the total number of yeses is 24. And remember, our total number of stressors is 26. So 24 out of the 26 stressors for this one block group is adverse in nature. It's higher than the 50th percentile as compared to the geographic point of comparison. And so then our next question is, well, we need to do that same type of calculation for the county and for the state, because we don't know is 24 high or is 24 low. We need some point of comparison in order to establish disparity. So we're going to count the total number of yeses for the county and the total number of yeses for the state. In this example, the county has 12 yeses and the state has 13 yeses. Obviously, 12 is lower than 13. We're going to take the lower of the two between the county and the state. And so we're going to establish our geographic point of comparison for the total number of yeses is going to be the county. So then our final question is our total count of 24 for our block group in question higher than or lower than the total count of yeses for the county, which we already established is our geographic point of comparison? Of course, 24 is higher than 12. And so we have determined, the EJMAP tool has determined that this one block group, which is the block group that we're standing in here today in Trenton, is higher than the 50th percentile, or it's going to be shaded in blue. It's going to mean that it is subject to adverse cumulative stressors, or in another way to say it is an environmental justice community. And so I hope that that is really good, like important information for you all to go in and be searching addresses and be looking up municipalities to see where OBCs are located and to see what types of stressors and pollution OBCs are contending with and what determines them to be an environmental justice community. Lastly, I do just want to point out one additional point of functionality within the tool, and that's you're able to filter the overburdened communities across the state by a specific stressor. So say, for example, you're working on a grant application and you're trying to get funding in your community to plant trees, for example. You can go in and look at and filter the OBCs that experience adverse stressors for impervious cover, or for lack of tree canopy, or for lack of open space. So that type of data about where these OBCs are that are subject to some type of disproportionate pollution that's related to whatever project or grant that you're working on, you can see like and filter for just those OBCs. So I wanted to point out that part of functionality for the tool, because it could be helpful for some of the work that you're working on in your communities. Okay, and with that, I will take questions. How much time do we have? We have time for 5 minutes left. Okay. Any questions? Okay, any in the room? Okay. Go for it, Mike.
Just wanted to share that EJMAP part of all the data described. There's also. That in EJMAP, apart from all the information you described, there are also links to other reports of information that would allow you to see the
Yeah.
air permits for that facility and other emission reports and other data that gives you much more specific information for the facility within that area. So you have a better understanding of what's going on there.
Yeah, really good point. Thanks, Mike. There are ways to see additional information about the facilities, like the permits that the facility has and violations that the facility might be experiencing or is subject to. So there's a lot of good information that has broad applicability for the work that you may be working on in your community beyond the environmental justice regulations itself. So encourage people to play around with it and click those links to different pieces of information, enforcement reports and applications. Mike did a really good talk in the first iteration or the first segment of our Navigating the DEP System seminar series about some of our online tools. And we have that posted on OEJ's, the Office of Environmental Justice's website. So encourage people to continue on this journey with us for the Navigating the DEP series. We really thank you for your time and your attention and your questions tonight. And we'll see you at our next seminar series, which is Understanding the Regulatory Process Part 2. And so in tonight's session, we focused on the environmental justice law and the regulations. In the next part, we'll focus on the specific permitting functions of air, of water, of solid waste, of land use, and really dig into the specifics beyond the environmental justice law and regs, but there are other ways that the department permits and provides authorizations for other permitting schemes under our jurisdiction. So please stay tuned for that. We also have another event that we're having in partnership with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance that Halima earlier in the night spoke about. And so we'll send follow-up links in the chat and also via email about our upcoming sessions and events. We hope that you will stick with us and continue to build a partnership with us as we continue to further the promise of environmental justice together. So with that, I say good night to you, and hopefully this isn't the last time that we speak. Talk soon.